My neighbor thought my farm was her personal shortcut, so I let the mud teach her a lesson she'd never forget. What began as a minor inconvenience quickly revealed something far more unsettling, a mindset rooted in entitlement rather than mutual respect. The conflict was never truly about 5 minutes of driving time or even about a strip of flattened alfalfa. It was about ownership, boundaries, and the belief that personal convenience outweighs another person's rights. When someone treats private land as if it were public property, they are not simply bending a rule. They are dismissing the labor, history, and livelihood tied to that land. In this case, the farm was not an empty lot or an abandoned field. It represented over 100 years of family work, sacrifice, and stewardship. Generations had planted, harvested, repaired fences, and endured storms on that soil. Every acre carried value not just in dollars, but in memory and identity. Yet, to someone driven by entitlement, none of that mattered. All that mattered was shaving a few minutes off a commute. Entitlement often disguises itself as harmless efficiency. It's just a shortcut. It's just a little patch. It's not hurting anyone. These phrases reduce the impact of the action and minimize the harm done. But harm does not have to be catastrophic to be real. Tire ruts and soft earth damage crops. Broken fences cost time and money to repair. Compacted soil affects future yields. Beyond the physical damage lies something deeper, the erosion of respect. When clear signs are posted and ignored, when polite requests are dismissed with a smile, and when even law enforcement warnings fail to change behavior, it reveals a belief that rules apply to everyone else. Entitlement thrives on this assumption of exemption, and it feeds on the idea that consequences are negotiable, especially if one feels socially or economically superior. The presence of the Homeowners Association intensified this dynamic. HOAs are often built around rules, standards, and enforcement mechanisms designed to preserve property values and order within a community. Ironically, the very person benefiting from such structured governance chose to disregard the most basic rule of property ownership: do not trespass. There is a contradiction in demanding compliance within one's own neighborhood, while dismissing the rights of someone outside it. That contradiction exposes the selective morality of entitlement. It is not about fairness. It is about control and convenience. The repeated trespassing was not an accident or a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate choice made day after day. Each morning's drive across the field reinforced the same message: your property boundaries do not apply to me. Each ignored sign and bypassed warning strengthened the pattern. Over time, repetition turns misconduct into habit, and habit into perceived legitimacy. The more often she crossed the field without immediate consequence, the more justified she likely felt. In doing so, entitlement grows when it is not challenged effectively. It becomes normalized in the mind of the person benefiting from it. From her perspective, perhaps the field looked unused, open, or insignificant. Perhaps she saw only dirt and weeds, not investment and livelihood. That perception gap is crucial. When someone does not understand or value the effort behind what they are crossing, they find it easier to dismiss the impact. Farmers know that soil is not just ground, it is a living system. Young alfalfa is not just greenery. It represents planning, seed costs, labor, and future harvest. A fence is not just wood and wire. It is protection, boundary, and responsibility. Entitlement reduces these realities to obstacles in the way of personal gain. There is also a psychological component to entitlement that manifests in tone and reaction. The casual smile, the wave, the dismissive "it's fine" indicate an internal script that frames objections as overreactions. When confronted, the response was not apology or reconsideration, but irritation. Don't be dramatic, it's just weeds. These responses shift blame onto the person enforcing the boundary, portraying them as unreasonable. This inversion is common in entitlement conflicts. The injured party is painted as the aggressor for insisting on rights that should never have been questioned. It reframes the narrative from trespass to inconvenience, from violation to trivial dispute. Another layer of entitlement appears in the reliance on perceived status. Driving a luxury SUV, living in the prominent corner house, belonging to a structured HOA community, these details can subtly reinforce a sense of superiority. When someone believes their time is more valuable, their schedule more important, their needs more urgent, they may unconsciously rank others lower. That hierarchy justifies cutting across a field because, in their mind, the farmer's time and labor are less critical than their own commute. This value distortion is not always conscious, but it is powerful. It allows people to rationalize behavior that would otherwise feel wrong. The persistence after a sheriff's visit is perhaps the clearest evidence of entitlement's depth. Law enforcement involvement should signal seriousness. It establishes that the issue is not personal. preference but legal boundary. Choosing to continue afterward demonstrates a belief that consequences are either unlikely or manageable. It suggests confidence that one can talk their way out, ignore warnings, or escalate without real cost. Entitlement often flourishes in environments where previous infractions went unpunished or where social position shielded someone from accountability. The conflict also highlights the tension between rural and suburban values. Farming communities often operate on mutual respect, handshake agreements, and a shared understanding of land stewardship. Suburban developments, particularly those governed by HOAs, operate on codified rules and convenience-based living. When these worlds meet, misunderstandings can arise. But this case goes beyond misunderstanding. It reflects a clash between a long-standing relationship with land and a transactional approach to space. To the farmer, land is heritage and responsibility. To the commuter, land may simply be open terrain, available for use if it shortens a route. At its core, the entitlement displayed here is about boundaries both physical and moral. Physical boundaries are marked by fences and signs. Moral boundaries are marked by empathy and respect. When someone crosses the physical without regard for the moral, conflict becomes inevitable. The refusal to acknowledge harm or adjust behavior transforms a solvable issue into a prolonged dispute. If, at the first conversation, she had apologized and agreed to stop, the story would have ended quietly. Instead, repeated dismissal forced the issue to escalate. Entitlement also often blinds individuals to long-term risk. By continuing to trespass, she exposed herself to potential damage, legal trouble, and financial cost. Yet, the short-term reward of saving 5 minutes overshadowed those risks. This is a common cognitive bias. Immediate convenience outweighs abstract future consequences. The mind discounts what has not yet happened. Nothing bad happened yesterday, so nothing will happen tomorrow. Over time, this reasoning builds confidence until it collapses under the weight of reality. There is a broader societal reflection in this scenario. In many communities, debates over property rights, public access, and personal freedom surface regularly. The balance between individual convenience and collective respect is delicate. When individuals prioritize themselves without regard for others, that balance tips. Small acts of disregard accumulate, eroding trust between neighbors. Once trust erodes, cooperation becomes harder, and disputes become more adversarial. The entitlement shown here is not unique to one person. It mirrors a pattern seen in many contexts where personal benefit is pursued at someone else's expense. Yet, there is also an element of choice. At every stage, a different decision could have been made. She could have respected the first request. She could have complied after seeing the signs. She could have heeded the deputy's warning. Each opportunity represented a chance to shift from entitlement to accountability. That she did not take any of them reveals how deeply entrenched her perspective was. Entitlement can become part of identity, shaping how someone navigates conflict and authority. It is sustained by the belief that one's own judgment supersedes communal norms. The farmer's response, by contrast, underscores the contrast between entitlement and ownership. Ownership carries responsibility. It requires maintenance, patience, and adherence to law. It means repairing damage rather than causing it. It means seeking solutions within legal boundaries rather than reacting impulsively. The juxtaposition highlights two different value systems, one rooted in stewardship and one in convenience. When these systems collide, the outcome depends on who adapts and who refuses. Ultimately, the story's first key point is not simply that someone trespassed. It is that entitlement distorts perception, minimizes harm, and resists correction. It shows how sizely people can rationalize behavior when it benefits them and how stubborn that rationalization can become. It demonstrates that ownership is more than a legal title. It is an expression of effort and history, deserving respect. And it reveals that when respect is absent, conflict becomes inevitable. The damage to crops and fences may have been repairable, but the deeper issue was the dismissal of boundaries. That dismissal, repeated daily, turned a quiet farm into a battleground of principle. In the end, entitlement was the true antagonist. Patience is often mistaken for weakness, especially in conflicts where one party appears to be taking advantage of the other. Yet in reality, patience can be a deliberate strategy, a form of quiet strength that allows a person to think clearly instead of reacting impulsively. In this situation, the choice to remain calm rather than retaliate immediately was not passive submission. It was calculated restraint. When someone repeatedly violates boundaries, the natural instinct is to confront them forcefully, escalate the argument, or seek immediate retribution. But emotional reactions, while satisfying in the moment, often complicate matters. They can shift legal standing, muddy the narrative, and turn a straightforward issue into mutual hostility. Choosing patience, created space for a smarter solution to emerge. Each day that the trespassing continued added frustration, but it also provided information. It revealed patterns. The timing was consistent. The route was predictable. The behavior was habitual. That predictability became an advantage. Strategy requires observation, and observation requires composure. If anger had dictated the response, there might have been shouting matches, damaged property on both sides, or actions taken in haste that could lead to legal consequences. Instead, composure allowed for careful thought about what options were, both lawful and effective. The law was already technically on the landowner's side, but enforcement alone had proven insufficient. A warning from law enforcement did not change the behavior. Signs were ignored. Fences were broken. The problem was not a lack of rules. It was a lack of consequences that felt real to the offender. Recognizing that distinction is critical in strategic thinking. Sometimes people do not change because they believe they can avoid or outlast consequences. Therefore, the solution had to be something that imposed accountability without crossing any legal lines. That required creativity grounded in legitimacy. The memory of the old irrigation ditch was not just a nostalgic recollection. It was an example of using existing infrastructure knowledge to solve a modern problem. Farmers understand their land intimately. They know where the soil retains moisture, where runoff collects, and how terrain shifts after rainfall. That knowledge becomes a strategic asset. Reestablishing the ditch was not sabotage. It was a lawful restoration of a previous agricultural feature. That distinction matters deeply. Acting within legal boundaries ensures that moral and legal authority remain intact. If the response had involved hidden traps, deliberate hazards, or anything designed to cause injury, the situation could have reversed dramatically, turning the landowner into the one at fault. Smart strategy avoids that trap. It seeks resolution, not revenge that jeopardizes one's own standing. There is also discipline in waiting for the right moment. The forecasted storm presented an opportunity, but opportunity is useless without preparation. Digging the trench before the rain required foresight. It meant anticipating natural forces and aligning them with a lawful objective. Strategy often involves working with circumstances rather than forcing them. The rain was not controlled, but it was predicted. By preparing in advance, the natural conditions amplified the effectiveness of the solution. This demonstrates another key aspect of smart strategy: leverage. Instead of escalating conflict through confrontation, the solution leveraged gravity, water, and soil composition. It allowed the environment itself to enforce the boundary that words and warnings could not. Patience also protects one's emotional energy. Continuous anger drains clarity. By choosing not to argue every morning, not to escalate verbally, and not to retaliate impulsively, mental space was preserved for thoughtful planning. Strategic patience does not mean ignoring a problem. It means resisting the urge to solve it recklessly. It involves asking critical questions. What outcome do I want? What actions are within my rights? How can this be resolved permanently rather than temporarily? Each of these questions shifts focus from reaction to resolution. The chosen approach solved the problem in a way that required no further confrontation. After the incident, there were no more arguments, no more signs needed, no more daily monitoring. The behavior stopped because the cost of continuing exceeded the benefit. That is the hallmark of effective strategy. Altering incentives. Instead of trying to persuade through repeated discussion, the situation was structured so that, continuing the trespass became undesirable. Importantly, the strategy did not rely on humiliation alone. It relied on natural consequences. The vehicle became stuck because it left the road and entered soft ground. That outcome was foreseeable. The responsibility remained with the driver. Maintaining this moral clarity is essential in strategic conflict resolution. When someone chooses to ignore boundaries, and those boundaries are reinforced through lawful means, accountability remains squarely where it belongs. Another dimension of this patience is restraint in communication. Even after the incident, there was no gloating, confrontation, no admission of intent, no aggressive escalation. Calm/measured responses preserve credibility. In conflicts, credibility is currency. If emotions spiral out of control, credibility diminishes. Remaining composed reinforces the perception that one is acting reasonably and within rights. Strategic patience also reflects confidence. It signals that one does not need to shout or threaten to assert authority. The land itself, properly managed, becomes the enforcer. This quiet confidence contrasts sharply with impulsive retaliation, which often reveals insecurity or desperation. By waiting, planning, and executing within legal limits, authority was demonstrated rather than demanded. It is also worth noting that smart strategy often requires understanding the opponent's mindset. The trespasser valued time and convenience. Therefore, The consequence needed to disrupt that convenience significantly enough to change behavior. A minor inconvenience might have been dismissed. A serious financial and logistical setback, however, would command attention. This is strategic calibration, matching the response, proportionally but effectively, to the behavior. Too little impact would fail. Too much could create legal backlash. The chosen solution struck a balance. It was lawful, proportional, and decisive. Furthermore, patience prevents regret. Impulsive actions often lead to second-guessing or unintended fallout. By thinking through the plan carefully, ensuring legality, and anticipating outcomes, the risk of regret was minimized. Strategy is about foresight. It imagines not only the immediate result but the aftermath. Would there be lawsuits? Would there be liability? Would there be escalation? Each of these possibilities must be weighed before acting. Acting within clear, legal rights dramatically reduces these risks. There is also a philosophical element to strategic patience. It embodies the principle that justice does not always require aggression. Sometimes, justice requires structure. By restoring the ditch, the boundary was not merely defended verbally. It was reinforced physically in a lawful manner. This transforms the conflict from a personal feud into a matter of property management. It depersonalizes the dispute. The land was prepared for rain. The rain came. A vehicle left the roadway and encountered soft ground. The sequence speaks for itself. Smart strategy often removes the need for further argument because reality delivers the lesson more effectively than words. In addition, patience cultivates resilience. Enduring 2 weeks of repeated trespass without losing composure required emotional control. That control strengthened the eventual response. It ensured that the solution was not fueled by rage but by reason. Emotional regulation is a cornerstone of strategic thinking. When emotions dominate, when calm prevails, perspective widens, revealing options that anger might obscure. Strategic patience is also efficient. Instead of engaging in endless daily disputes, one decisive, lawful action resolved the issue permanently. Efficiencies, not just about speed, it is about sustainability. A solution that ends a problem long-term is more efficient than repeated short-term fixes. Repairing fences daily is inefficient. Installing stronger barriers within legal rights is sustainable. The trench served as a barrier aligned with agricultural purpose. It addressed both land management and boundary enforcement simultaneously. Ultimately, the second key point underscores that intelligence in conflict lies not in aggression but in alignment, aligning action with law, timing with opportunity, and consequence with behavior. It shows that patience is not the absence of action but the preparation for effective action. It reveals that strategy thrives on observation, legality, and proportional response. Most importantly, it demonstrates that maintaining composure preserves both moral high ground and practical advantage. In situations where others act impulsively or arrogantly, the steady thinker often prevails. By choosing not to react immediately, by studying the land and the forecast, by acting within rights and allowing natural forces to do the rest, the conflict was resolved cleanly and conclusively. Patience transformed frustration into foresight, and foresight into a solution that required no further words. Actions carry weight, whether acknowledged or not, and consequences often arrive whether invited or resisted. In this situation, the central lesson revolves around the simple but powerful truth that behavior, repeated over time, inevitably produces results. For weeks, the repeated trespassing seemed to yield no meaningful repercussions. Each morning, the shortcut worked. Each afternoon ended without penalty. Warnings were ignored, signs dismissed, even a visit from law enforcement brushed aside. That pattern created a false sense of security. When actions go unchecked long enough, people begin to believe they are justified. The absence of immediate consequences can be misinterpreted as permission. That illusion is dangerous because it reinforces the very behavior that will eventually lead to a harsher reckoning. Consequences are not always instant. Sometimes they are delayed, building quietly beneath the surface. In many ways, this delay makes them more powerful. The repeated choice to ignore boundaries created momentum. Each decision compounded the next, layering assumption upon assumption. Nothing happened yesterday, so nothing will happen today. That reasoning feels logical in the short term. Yet it ignores a fundamental principle. Patterns eventually meet resistance. When someone repeatedly crosses a line, the line does not disappear. It becomes more firmly defined. What transformed this situation was not anger or confrontation, but the moment when actions met undeniable reality. The vehicle leaving the pavement and entering the soft earth was not an accident in the purest sense. It was the predictable outcome of prior decisions. The driver chose to trespass. The driver chose to ignore warnings. The driver chose to accelerate through unfamiliar terrain. Each step led logically to the next. The mud did not discriminate or retaliate. It responded to weight, speed, and soil conditions. In that neutrality lies the clarity of consequence. Nature does not negotiate. It does not respond to status, impatience, or entitlement. It reacts according to consistent principles. When the SUV sank, it did so because physics demanded it. This is what makes the lesson so powerful. It was not imposed through argument, but revealed through cause and effect. There is a psychological shift that occurs when someone experiences the direct outcome of their own behavior. External warnings can be dismissed as exaggerated or unfair. But when the outcome is tangible financial cost, inconvenience, embarrassment, it becomes harder to deflect responsibility. The moment the wheels spun helplessly in the mud, denial lost its footing. The shortcut was no longer convenient. It was expensive, it was humiliating, it was time-consuming. The very thing that motivated the behavior, saving 5 minutes, was overshadowed by hours of delay and significant repair costs. Consequences often reverse incentives. They realign priorities by demonstrating that short-term gains can produce long-term losses. The depth of the lesson lies in its undeniable. No one forced the vehicle into the ditch. No one commanded the driver to accelerate through standing water. The choice was voluntary, repeated, and deliberate. That ownership of choice is central to understanding accountability. When individuals attempt to shift blame, accusing others of setting traps or creating obstacles, they are often resisting the comfortable truth that their own decisions led them there. But accountability requires acknowledging agency. Agency means having the power to choose. It also means bearing the outcome of that choice. This dynamic extends far beyond a single incident. It reflects a broader truth about how boundaries function. In society, boundaries are meaningful only when they are respected or enforced. When they are ignored repeatedly without consequence, they lose perceived authority. However, when actions produce tangible outcomes, boundaries regain strength. In this case, the physical boundary of private property was reinforced by the natural consequence of leaving established roads. The experience recalibrated behavior more effectively than any conversation could. Embarrassment also plays a role in consequence. Being stranded, requiring assistance, and facing public visibility can intensify the lesson. While embarrassment alone is not always constructive, when paired with clear personal responsibility, it can catalyze reflection. The incident forced a confrontation, not just with mud, but with the chain of decisions that led there. Reflection often begins when inconvenience becomes unavoidable. The financial impact further deepened the lesson. Monetary consequences translate abstract violations into measurable loss. Repair bills, towing fees, and potential vehicle damage transform just a shortcut into a costly mistake. Financial accountability carries weight because it is concrete. It quantifies the price of disregard. In doing so, it counters the earlier minimization of harm. What was dismissed as just weeds now carried a bill attached. This inversion highlights the proportionality of consequence. Small acts of disrespect can produce large repercussions when sustained over time. Importantly, the consequence did not escalate into legal battles or prolonged hostility. It resolved the behavior. Cleanly, the trespassing stopped. That cessation underscores another truth. Effective consequences change conduct. When someone experiences a result significant enough to outweigh perceived benefits, they adapt. Adaptation is a sign that the lesson has taken root. The goal of consequence is not revenge, but correction. In this case, correction occurred. The field was no longer used as a shortcut. The boundary was respected. That outcome demonstrates the practical value of allowing natural results to unfold. There is also a moral symmetry in the situation. The farmer repaired fences repeatedly, absorbing inconvenience and costs caused by someone else's choices. The eventual incident shifted that burden back onto the one creating it. Consequence restores balance. It ensures that the person generating disruption bears its weight. Without such balance, resentment festers and injustice lingers. Restoring balance does not require aggression. It requires alignment between action and outcome. The mud served as that alignment. The broader philosophical lesson is that consequences are teachers. They instruct more vividly than lectures. They reveal cause and effect with clarity that words cannot always achieve. When people avoid consequences repeatedly, they may never confront the implications of their behavior. Shielding someone from the results of their choices can enable repetition. Allowing natural consequences to occur within lawful bounds preserves both fairness and integrity. It reinforces the idea that freedom to choose is inseparable from responsibility for outcomes. Another layer of this lesson involves delayed accountability. The weeks of unchallenged trespassing may have created confidence, even arrogance. That built up made the eventual consequence more striking. It shattered the illusion of immunity. The sudden shift from effortless shortcut to immobilized vehicle underscored how quickly circumstances can change. This unpredictability reinforces caution. When people realize that their actions carry latent risk, they are more likely to reconsider future decisions. The emotional intensity of the moment also imprints memory. Strong experiences, those involving stress or embarrassment, tend to linger in the mind. That lingering memory acts as a deterrent. The next time temptation arises to ignore a boundary, the recollection of being stuck, waiting hours for assistance, and paying substantial fees resurfaces memory becomes a safeguard. In this way, consequence extends beyond the immediate event. It shapes future behavior. The situation also illustrates that consequences do not require hostility to be effective. Calm acknowledgement of what occurred reinforced the lesson. There was no shouting, no gloating confession, no escalation. Just a statement of fact. This is private property, and you chose to drive here. That composure underscored the inevitability of the outcome. When consequences are delivered without cruelty, they carry moral clarity. They become harder to contest. Finally, this key point affirms a timeless principle. Respect for boundaries prevents hardship. Had the boundary been honored from the beginning, none of the cost, embarrassment, or delay would have occurred. The simplest path using the designated road was always available. Choosing otherwise created the very problem that later demanded resolution. That symmetry reveals the quiet logic of consequence. Actions are seeds, outcomes are harvest. What is planted through repeated choice eventually grows into tangible reality. In this story, disregard was planted daily. The harvest arrived in the form of mud, delay, and expense. And once that harvest was gathered, the planting ceased.